in this country, PV, solar, hydro, wind, pros and cons of that type of thing. And even looking at the gas, nuclear, where is all this going? So, what I'm trying to do is give you a forward projection and just some thoughts about, what does the world look like, or what does the U.S. look like in 10 years, 20, 30 years from now. So I don't have any agenda. I don't take offense to, at the end of it says, I don't believe this, that, or anything else. For me, this was an interesting group because it's a very varied group of people. Everybody has a lot of different perspectives, and I like that. I like that, a little bit of chaos in there, and see what everybody's viewpoints are. So I'm always open to listening here. Interesting slides of San Francisco in the daylight and at night. Down there. I don't think the sun sets quite that fast, but I thought it was a really cool picture. So one of the things that I like to talk about first is capacity, and we'll talk about capacity factors. And most of the material that I have is from, NREL or EIA or, other government sources. So I'm not making any of this stuff up. I'm just, taking what the government's providing, taking their data, but maybe just cutting it a little bit differently than they do or than the utility might look for it. What's interesting about this graph, and a lot of times these things need a fair amount of explanation. So up on the left is the current capacity. So you see coal, for example, has the capacity for all the energy that's used in this country. There's 25% capacity. Natural gas, there's a lot more capacity for natural gas. In other words, if you went out and counted the turbines that are sitting on the ground that are ready to run, there's more natural gas turbines than there are steam turbines off of a coal plant, okay? And same thing with nuclear. And then what this graph does is say, well, when did those come into, when was that asset put into the ground? So what's fascinating about that is all the coal plants, of course, were put back in the ground here. There was some natural gas. And then nuclear came on, and it looked kind of like, oh, that might be the Holy Grail. And you had 3 Mile Island, and you can see what happened after 3 Mile Island. It stopped. It was a lot of pent-up. It said stop. But a lot of things were permitted, so once they got through all that, they built. But then that's been it, okay? And so there's not a lot of nuclear going on. Now, the other thing that's really fascinating about this chart is, what is this? And all of a sudden, there's this huge spike of natural gas assets. And people, and if you remember back, and we'll talk more about the California energy crisis and a lot of things going on, Calpine ended up going bankrupt. Calpine's business model was they put in all these natural gas turbines because they knew that natural gas was clean. It was easy to put in the turbine, very cost effective. You can turn them on and turn them off. They're extremely efficient, especially the combined cycle engines. And at one time, they had, 2 or 3 years production from GE and from Siemens Westinghouse. I mean, they just, had the whole thing. But you can see they kind of overbet. When it hit the peak, they had so many assets in the ground and so much stuff, and then natural gas went through the roof, and it wiped them out, which is kind of interesting because you kind of wonder what made that happen. What forces were at work to make the price of natural gas wipe out Calpine, because they were clearly in control of this market. So that's just kind of a fascinating history of when the assets got put into the ground. And what's out there right now. This is a very recent graph. It just came out within the past month. It was fascinating, especially when you live in California. So SON's a San Onofre nuclear power generating system. Good luck, Tom, trying to catch me. I move around a lot. And so those units are going down. They just gave up trying to, between the regulatory, and it's just, it might make sense, but it's just not worth it to them. Economically, it's not worth it to them. It's interesting. They're suing MHI. I imagine what they'll end up doing. Now, all the infrastructure is there. I imagine they'll end up installing combined cycle natural gas turbines right on that site. There's no reason not to. And just, they probably won't even take down the domes. I mean, they can just sit there and do whatever, but they'll get the nuclear material out of there. But it has all the infrastructure. It has all the switch gear. It has all the transmission lines and everything else. There's no reason why they wouldn't just plop in a natural gas facility there at some time. They're shutting one down in Florida, one up in Wisconsin. And, what's interesting is you're not getting a lot of additions. So nuclear is waning. Not that there's anything necessarily inherently wrong with technology, but the barriers in this country are just too expensive to overcome. So it ends up becoming not cost effective just from a regulatory standpoint, not necessarily an engineering one. This is the same thing kind of going on with coal. They just announced, which is a very small number when you start looking at this, about 25 gigawatts of reductions, and I'll talk more about that. But again, these are coal plants that have actually been constructed, ones that are under construction, and then you can see the retirement. So almost kind of keeping even with things. But when you start looking at CO2 problems, and you can talk about global warming, but it's really obvious when you look at the ocean is becoming more acidic. It is absorbing the excess CO2, and there's a lot going on in the ocean. So, I don't want to get into a bunch of global warming, but there's a fact that the ocean is becoming more acidic, and coral reefs are getting damaged, and there's a lot of things going on there. And it is a direct consequence of having more CO2. So when you look at CO2 going into the atmosphere, it comes from, when you look at electric power, it comes from coal plants, okay? And when you look at transportation, it's coming from petroleum. So these are the three uses. Obviously the buildings are using the electric power, and industrial has like a main, line, but it's half electric and half of their own. But the real culprits here. So, one of the things is, from a coal-based energy standpoint, we have to address what are we doing with coal, and how are we going to move forward on coal, and what's the right fuel, and how do you deal with coal going forward? And then the other thing is, what do you do with petroleum, and what's the right way to run the transportation system? So those are two things I'd like to cover as we go forward. This is really a interesting chart. Now, the Obama administration, the EPA, just came out. People were really upset about this, but they've been working on this for a long time, and it makes complete sense. So regardless of what propaganda you may want to look at, the data would say that what the EPA is coming out with is saying you have to meet a certain threshold requirement. In other words, if you're not at least this clean, 1,000 pounds per CO2 per megawatt hour, if you're not meeting that threshold, you got a dirty old system. And what's happening is kind of like old buildings. So they run old coal plants, and they don't want to make any changes to them, because if you make changes to it, then you have to meet the new codes. And so enough of that, and you start looking at these histograms, and the blue dots are the ones that they're closing. But if you look at some of these other things, look at the average age of a coal plant is, 50 years. If you the other mandate you could just say is, look, if it's 50 years old, unless there's some really good reason, why are we running this thing, or why are we running it the way we're running it? The other thing that's interesting about coal plants, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, and this is an important thing, are capacity factors. And so, you'll see that coal plants run at a pretty high capacity factor, but the issue would be if a coal plant's not running at a high capacity factor, again, why is it running at all? You got to think about the way that energy is generated in a coal plant or in a nuclear plant. There's steam turbines, so you get everything hot and it gets running, and they're best left running. It's the transition that's hard to get them up and then get them down. Natural gas plants are more like a jet engine, so they're throttleable and you can turn them on and off. So that's one of the advantages of the natural gas. But there's a lot more room for coal to be shut down. And, quite frankly, I have to applaud the Obama administration for having the guts, because there's a lot of, it's nice being in your second term, to go into a lot of areas in the United States that are heavily reliant on coal. This is a $1 trillion industry. So money talks. There's a lot going on.